There is a city in the middle of a desert that has skyscrapers. Not modern ones. Not steel and glass. These are made of mud, sun-dried, hand-packed, centuries-old mud, and they rise 8, 10, sometimes 11 stories into a sky so blue it almost looks painted. No one talks about this place. And that is exactly why we're here. Before we go any further, I need you to stop for a second and really think about what I just said. Because I know how that sounds. Mud skyscrapers. In a desert. In Yemen. Of all places. But here's what most people don't know, and what the rest of the world has largely forgotten. Yemen is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on the planet. This is not a country that appeared on a map a few hundred years ago. This is a land where people were building cities, engineering water systems, trading with the Roman Empire, and writing in their own script, while most of the world was still figuring out agriculture. And yet, when you say Yemen today, most people think of one thing: conflict. They think of headlines. They think of crisis. They think of a place you don't go. But history doesn't disappear just because a place is hurting. The stones don't stop being ancient. The towers don't stop standing. And the story, the deep, layered, thousands of years old story of this land, doesn't stop being one of the most extraordinary on earth. So today we're going there. Not physically, but in the only way we can right now, through the footage, the archaeology, the history, and the people who have dedicated their lives to understanding what Yemen really is. And I promise you, by the end of this video you will look at this country completely differently. Let's start with the place that stopped me cold the first time I saw a photograph of it. It's called Shibam. And the moment you lay eyes on it, your brain short circuits. Because what you're looking at should not exist. A walled city rising out of the flat floor of a desert valley, packed so tightly with tower houses that from a distance it genuinely looks like a modern downtown. A skyline dropped into the middle of nowhere. British explorer Freya Stark saw it for the first time in the 1930s and called it the Manhattan of the desert. And honestly, that description doesn't even do it justice. Manhattan was built in the 20th century with steel, concrete, cranes, and engineering software. Shibam was built in the 16th century, rebuilt actually after a catastrophic flood in 1532, using nothing but mud bricks, wooden beams, and an understanding of architecture so sophisticated it has never been fully replicated. The city is home to roughly 500 buildings. Some of them are over 30 meters tall. And they are all, every single one of them, made of earth. UNESCO recognized it in 1982 as a World Heritage Site, calling it one of the oldest and most perfect examples of urban planning based on the principle of vertical construction. Vertical construction. This is a concept we think of as modern, the idea of building up instead of out, of stacking living space to conserve land. Shibam figured this out in the 3rd century AD. Let that sit for a moment. When the people of Shibam were engineering their first high-rise apartment buildings, Rome was still the center of the known world. But Shibam is only the beginning. Because Yemen, the ancient land the Romans called Arabia Felix, meaning fortunate Arabia or happy Arabia, was once the wealthiest corner of the known world. It sat at the crossroads of the greatest trade routes in history. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, gold. Everything the ancient world desired passed through Yemen. The Queen of Sheba, if she existed, and many historians believe she did, is said to have ruled from this land. This was not a backwater. This was the center. And what was built here, what was carved into mountains, stacked in deserts, and woven into the culture of its people, is still here. Battered in some places, endangered in others, but still here. The old city of Sana'a, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, contains over 6,000 buildings that have stood for more than 1,000 years. Intricate tower houses decorated with elaborate geometric patterns, stained glass windows called camarillas that scatter colored light across ancient stone floors, markets that have been trading in the same narrow streets since the 7th century. The ancient dam at Marib, one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world, held back enough water to feed an entire kingdom. When it finally broke for the last time in the 6th century AD, it triggered a migration so massive it reshaped the entire Arabian Peninsula. Socotra Island, floating in the Indian Ocean off Yemen's coast, looks like it belongs on another planet entirely. It is home to hundreds of species found nowhere else on Earth, including the dragon blood tree, a prehistoric umbrella-shaped tree that bleeds dark red sap and has survived here since before humans walked the land. This is Yemen. In this video we're going to take you through 10 chapters of one of history's most overlooked stories. We'll walk the ancient alleyways of Sana'a. We'll stand at the edge of Wadi Hadramaut and look out at Shibam's impossible skyline. We'll trace the incense roads, explore forgotten kingdoms, and sit with the weight of what it means for a civilization this rich, this layered, this genuinely extraordinary, to be so misunderstood by the modern world. This place doesn't feel real, but it is. And it has been for a very, very long time. Let's go. To understand Yemen, you have to go back. Way back. Not 100 years. Not 500. We're talking thousands of years, to a time when this land wasn't a footnote in the news, but the headline of the entire ancient world. The Arabian Peninsula, for most people, conjures images of endless sand and empty desert. But Yemen sits at the southwestern tip of that peninsula, where the desert breaks open into mountains, valleys, and coastlines kissed by two seas, the Red Sea to the west and the Arabian Sea to the south. The geography alone made it extraordinary. It was the one corner of Arabia where rain actually fell, where crops grew, where civilizations could take root and thrive. The Romans had a name for it, Arabia Felix. Fortunate Arabia. Happy Arabia. That name tells you everything. While the rest of the peninsula baked under an unforgiving sun, Yemen was green. Terraced hillsides cascaded down ancient mountains. Wadis, those great river valleys that flood seasonally, carried water to fields and cities. And sitting right at the intersection of Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean, Yemen became something the ancient world absolutely could not live without. A crossroads. The incense trade, frankincense and myrrh, was the oil industry of the ancient world. These resins, harvested from trees that grew almost exclusively in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, were burned in temples from Rome to Babylon, from Jerusalem to Alexandria. Every major religion, every royal court, every funeral rite in the ancient Mediterranean world required them, and almost all of it passed through Yemen. The wealth this generated was staggering. Ancient Yemeni kingdoms, the Sabaeans, the Minians, the Katabanians, the Himyarites, grew fabulously rich controlling these routes. They built dams, palaces, temples, and cities. They developed their own writing system, their own calendar, their own laws. And then there is the legend of the Queen of Sheba. Known in Arabic as Bilqis, she is mentioned in the Bible, the Quran, and Ethiopian tradition. A queen of extraordinary intelligence and wealth who reportedly traveled to visit King Solomon in Jerusalem, bearing gifts of gold, spices, and precious stones. Whether she was historical fact or ancient mythology, scholars widely agree that if she existed, she came from here. From this land. From the kingdom of Saba, whose ruins still stand today in Marib. Yemen wasn't on the edge of history. It was at the center of it. And then, slowly it was forgotten. Trade routes shifted. The Great Dam at Marib collapsed. Empires rose elsewhere. And over the centuries the rest of the world moved on, leaving behind one of the most remarkable civilizations ever built, preserved almost perfectly in stone, mud, and memory. That is what we've come to find. Most old cities have an old quarter. A preserved section, roped off and museum-like, where tourists walk through and imagine what life used to be. Sana'a is different. The old city of Sana'a, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is not a relic. It is not a reconstruction. It is a living, breathing, fully inhabited city that has been continuously occupied for more than 2,500 years. People are born here. They grow up here. They open shops, raise families, argue with their neighbors, and fall asleep to the sound of the same call to prayer that has echoed through these streets for over 1,000 years. Walking into the old city feels less like sightseeing and more like slipping through a crack in time. The buildings are unlike anything else on Earth. Tower houses 4, 5, 6 stories tall, built from dark volcanic stone at the base and pale mud brick above, decorated with intricate white geometric patterns called gypsum friezes that frame every window and edge like lace stitched into stone. At the very top of each tower, rows of arched windows are filled with translucent alabaster or stained glass, the famous camarillas, that scatter pools of amber, green, and rose light across interior rooms at certain hours of the day. From the outside, the effect is mesmerizing. An entire city that looks like it was designed by someone who couldn't decide between a fortress and a wedding cake. Inside the walls, the streets narrow to alleys. The alleys narrow to passages. Merchants sell everything from silver jewelry to fresh ground coffee to bolts of brightly dyed cloth. The air carries the mingled scent of wood smoke, cardamom, and the sharp sweetness of cat, the leafy stimulant that Yemeni men have been chewing in social gatherings for centuries, cheeks bulging, afternoons slowly dissolving into conversation and laughter. The Great Mosque of Sana'a sits near the heart of the old city. It is one of the earliest mosques ever built. Tradition holds it was constructed during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself, in the 7th century. Whether that timeline holds precisely under historical scrutiny or not, what is certain is that this mosque has been a place of continuous worship for over 1,300 years. The columns inside are Roman era, repurposed from even older structures. History stacked on history, layer after layer, all the way down. Nearby, the Bab al-Yemen, the Gate of Yemen, stands as the grand entrance to the old city. A thick, imposing archway built in the Ottoman period, flanked by towers, worn smooth by centuries of hands brushing against its stone. Passing through it feels like a threshold. A border not between countries but between centuries. What makes Sana'a so quietly devastating to learn about is not just its beauty. It's the fragility of it. In 2015, UNESCO placed the old city of Sana'a on its list of World Heritage in danger. Airstrikes during the Civil War damaged historic buildings. The ongoing conflict has disrupted the restoration work that mud brick architecture requires constantly just to survive. Rain erodes, time erodes, neglect erodes, and unlike concrete or stone, mud brick does not wait. But it is still standing. The minarets still rise above the rooftops at dawn. The camarillas still scatter their colored light. The old men still sit in the same doorways their grandfathers sat in. And the city, stubborn, ancient, and impossibly alive, keeps breathing. Some places refuse to disappear. Sana'a is one of them. Now we go to the place that started all of this. The place that, when I first saw a photograph of it, made me stop scrolling and just stare. Shibam. To get there, you travel deep into Wadi Hadramaut, one of the longest and widest valleys in the Arabian Peninsula. The drive itself is a slow unwrapping. The landscape is barren, ochre, and enormous. Flat desert stretching in every direction, broken only by the occasional palm grove hugging a dry riverbed. You could drive for an hour and see almost nothing. And then, without warning, it appears. A cluster of towers rising straight out of the valley floor. Packed so tightly together they form a single, unified skyline. Mud brown against a pale sky, angular and vertical and completely, utterly impossible looking. Your first instinct is that you're seeing things. That the heat is playing tricks. That your brain is pattern matching something man-made onto a natural rock formation. But no, it's real. Every tower is real. And people live inside them. Br. Shibam's story begins around the 3rd century AD, when it became the capital of the ancient kingdom of Hadramaut after the destruction of the earlier capital, Shabwa. But the city as it looks today, that famous jaw-dropping skyline, was largely rebuilt after a catastrophic flood in 1532 that swept through the wadi and undermined the foundations of the older structures. What the people of Shibam did next is the part that still astonishes architects and urban planners today. Instead of spreading outward, the instinct of almost every other civilization in history when given open desert to build on, they built up. Straight up. They designed a city on a strict vertical grid, maximizing every square meter of the rocky spur the city sits on, and constructed tower houses that reached 5, 7, 8, even 11 stories into the sky. All of it from mud brick, a mixture of earth, water, straw, and ash shaped by hand, dried in the sun, and stacked with a precision that has kept these buildings standing for 5 centuries. The result is what UNESCO called one of the oldest and most perfect examples of urban planning based on the principle of vertical construction. The world's first skyscraper city. Built not by engineers with software and cranes, but by ordinary people with an extraordinary understanding of their environment. Every design choice in Shibam was intentional. The buildings are packed closely together so they shade each other from the brutal desert sun, keeping the interior alleys cool. The windowless ground floors were used for livestock and grain storage, a buffer zone between the desert heat and the living quarters above. The higher you climbed in a building, the more status you had. The top floors were reserved for families, for socializing, for catching the breeze. Some buildings were even connected by elevated corridors and shared doors, a built-in escape network in case of attack from rival tribes. The locals call their city the City of Three Fives, roughly 500 buildings, a population of around 5,000 people, and a history spanning some 500 years in its current form. It is home to fewer than 600 tourists a year. On some days you might be the only outsider there. That thought alone is extraordinary. One of the most remarkable architectural achievements in human history, sitting largely unseen, largely unvisited, in the middle of a desert valley in Yemen. Standing at the edge of Wadi Hadramaut and looking at Shibam in the late afternoon light, when the mud towers turn gold and the shadows between them go deep blue, it doesn't feel like a place from this century. It barely feels like a place from this planet, but it is. And it has been here, quietly defying logic and gravity and time, for longer than most of the world's most famous monuments have existed. If Shibam is Yemen's most visually stunning achievement, then Marib is its most consequential. Because what was built here, in the desert of northeastern Yemen over 2,700 years ago, didn't just serve a city, it fed a kingdom. It sustained a civilization. And when it finally failed, its collapse set off a chain of events that would reshape the entire Arabian Peninsula. The Great Dam of Marib. At its peak, it was one of the most sophisticated engineering projects in the ancient world. A massive earthen and stone embankment stretching over 600 meters across the mouth of Wadi Dana, designed to capture the seasonal flash floods that roared down from the mountains and redirect them through a network of sluices, canals, and irrigation channels that watered over 9,600 hectares of farmland. That is not a small number. In a region where water meant the difference between life and death, the dam turned a harsh desert into one of the most productive agricultural zones in the ancient Middle East. It is the reason Marib became the capital of the Sabaean kingdom, the civilization most associated with the legendary Queen of Sheba. It is the reason Yemen was called Arabia Felix, Fortunate Arabia, because with this dam, fortune was engineered. Ancient inscriptions carved into stone near the dam site record its construction, its expansion, and the kings who maintained it. Greek and Roman writers described the wealth of Marib with barely disguised awe. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote of a land so fertile and so rich in aromatics that the very air smelled sweet. This was the world the dam made possible. For over 1,000 years it held. Engineers continuously maintained and expanded it. By the 5th century AD, the dam had been rebuilt and reinforced multiple times, with 2 great stone spillways carved into the rock on either side, some of which are still visible today. It was a living piece of infrastructure, not a monument but a machine. One that required constant attention, constant repair, constant investment. And then in 570 AD, it broke for the final time. The great flood that followed, recorded in the Quran as the Flood of Iram, was catastrophic. The irrigated fields dried up. The population, unable to survive without the agricultural system the dam had sustained, scattered across the Arabian Peninsula in one of the largest documented mass migrations in pre-Islamic history. Entire tribes relocated. Some went north toward Syria. Others went west toward the Hijaz. The ripple effects of that single structural failure can be traced through the genealogies and settlement patterns of Arab tribes for centuries afterward. Today, the ruins of the ancient dam still stand at the edge of the desert outside Marib, 2 great stone sluices jutting from a hillside, partially buried in sand, carved with inscriptions in the ancient South Arabian script that almost nobody can read anymore. A new dam, built in the 1980s with Arab League funding, now sits downstream. But it is the ruins of the old one that stop you cold. Because standing there, running your hand across stone that was cut and placed 2,700 years ago, stone that fed a kingdom, stone that bore the weight of an entire civilization's survival, you feel something that no textbook can quite prepare you for. You feel the scale of what was lost. Not just a structure. Not just a city, but a whole world. A whole way of organizing life around water, around seasons, around collective engineering that required an entire society to cooperate across generations. Marib is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. It is also still a conflict zone. The stones endure anyway. They have seen worse. There is an island off the coast of Yemen that looks like it belongs on another planet. No exaggeration. No poetic license. Scientists, biologists, and photographers who have spent their careers traveling the world say the same thing every time they arrive here for the first time. This cannot be Earth. Socotra Island sits in the Arabian Sea, about 240 kilometers east of the Horn of Africa and 380 kilometers south of the Yemeni mainland. It has been geographically isolated for so long, millions of years, that evolution went its own direction here entirely. The island is home to over 700 species of plants, birds, and animals found nowhere else on the planet. Nowhere. Not in a similar form. Not in a related version. Nowhere. The most iconic of these is the dragon blood tree. It looks like something a child would draw if asked to imagine a tree from another world. The trunk is thick and bare, shooting straight up before erupting at the top into a perfectly circular, umbrella-shaped canopy of dense, spiky leaves. When you cut the bark, it bleeds. A deep, dark, startling red sap that has been harvested for medicine, dye, and ritual use since ancient times. Entire forests of these trees cover Socotra's high plateau. Walking among them in the early morning mist, when the light is soft and the silence is total, is one of those experiences that people struggle to describe afterward. Not because it's indescribable, but because description feels inadequate. The word surreal gets used a lot. So does prehistoric. So does simply, I couldn't believe I was real. Socotra was known to ancient traders. The Greeks called it the island of the Dioscuri. Arab merchants stopped here on the incense routes. Marco Polo mentioned it. But because of its isolation and the difficulty of reaching it, it was never colonized or dramatically altered the way most islands in the world eventually were. That isolation is its miracle, and its ongoing protection. UNESCO designated the Socotra Archipelago a World Heritage Site in 2008, the only natural World Heritage Site in Yemen. The islanders speak a language called Socotri, an ancient South Arabian tongue with no written form, passed down entirely through oral tradition for thousands of years. A people, a language, a landscape, all of it existing outside the mainstream of history, preserving something the rest of the world didn't even know it was losing. Socotra doesn't feel like a part of Yemen. It barely feels like a part of Earth. But both things are true. We have spent a lot of time with stones and ruins and ancient engineering. And we should. They deserve it. But Yemen is not only its monuments. It never was. The thing that travelers who have managed to visit Yemen before and during the conflict consistently say, with a kind of quiet insistence as if they need you to understand this, is that the people are the revelation. Not the architecture. Not the history. The people. Yemenis are famously, almost legendarily hospitable. In a part of the world where hospitality is already a deeply held cultural value, Yemen stands out. Strangers are invited in for tea before names are exchanged. Meals appear from nowhere. Conversations begin immediately and go deep fast. Into family, into philosophy, into the kind of questions about life that most cultures reserve for old friendships. The social ritual at the center of Yemeni daily life is the cat session. In the early afternoons, men, and in some regions women, gather in a dedicated room of the house called the mafraj, typically the highest room in the tower house, with the best windows and the best view. They sit on cushions arranged around the walls. They chew cat, a mild leafy stimulant, and they talk. 4 hours. About politics, about poetry, about God, about crops, about their children and their fathers and their grandfathers. The mafraj is where Yemeni culture lives. It is where decisions are made, disputes are settled, stories are told, and songs are sung. It is where the oral history of a people is quietly, continuously preserved. Yemeni poetry is one of the great, largely untranslated literary traditions of the Arab world. Poets are celebrated figures. Verses are memorized and passed between generations the way other cultures pass down property. Music in Yemen varies dramatically by region. Coastal rhythms carry African influences absorbed through centuries of trade. Highland music is spare and plaintive. The songs of Hadramaut have a wandering, almost oceanic quality that reflects the Hadrami history of long-distance migration and return. And through all of it, through conflict and displacement and loss, ordinary Yemenis keep doing what their ancestors did. They gather. They talk. They sing. They remember. A civilization is not only what it builds. It is what it carries inside itself, generation to generation, regardless of what happens to the buildings. Yemen carries a great deal. More than the world currently gives it credit for. There is a word UNESCO uses when a World Heritage Site is in serious danger of disappearing. Endangered. Right now, 4 of Yemen's 5 UNESCO World Heritage Sites carry that label. The old city of Sana'a, Shibam. The historic town of Zaybid. The ancient landmarks of Marib. All of them on the danger list. All of them at risk not just from conflict, but from neglect, from erosion, from the simple fact that mud brick architecture requires constant human attention to survive, and the humans who would normally provide that attention are displaced, exhausted, or gone. This is not abstract. In Sana'a, airstrikes damaged historic tower houses that had stood for 600 years. In Shibam, the foundations of buildings that survived floods, tribal wars, and centuries of desert storms are now compromised by years of deferred maintenance. In Zaybid, once the intellectual capital of the Islamic world, home to a university that taught algebra to the ancient Arab world, whole neighborhoods of historic buildings have collapsed or been replaced with concrete, erasing streetscapes that existed since the medieval period. And yet UNESCO teams are still working. Local preservation organizations are still documenting. Architects are still traveling into conflict zones with cameras and measuring tapes, recording everything they can before more of it disappears. Because documentation is itself a form of survival. A building that is photographed, measured, and understood can theoretically be rebuilt. A building that disappears without record is gone in every sense, from the landscape and from memory. There is something unbearable about watching a civilization this old, this layered, this genuinely irreplaceable race against time, not because of age but because of circumstance. History has no obligation to wait for us to pay attention. These places are not waiting. Here is something worth sitting with. The civilizations that built Shibam, that engineered the dam at Marib, that turned Sana'a into one of the most architecturally extraordinary cities in the world, they did not think of themselves as ancient. They thought of themselves as alive. They were solving real problems, building homes for real families, managing water for real harvests, trading real goods across real roads to real markets that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. They were just people. Extraordinarily capable, creative, determined people, but people. And the people who live in these places today are their direct descendants. Not metaphorically, literally. The families who still inhabit the tower houses of Shibam are the families who built them. The traders in the souks of Sana'a are working the same commercial corridors their great-great-grandparents worked. The fishermen of Socotra still speak a language their ancestors spoke before the written word reached the island. This is not a dead civilization behind glass. It is a living one under pressure. The Hadrami diaspora, descendants of Yemenis from the Hadramaut region, spread across Southeast Asia, East Africa, and the Gulf over centuries of migration. Today there are millions of people of Yemeni descent in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and beyond, many of whom still identify deeply with a homeland most of them have never visited. They send remittances. They maintain connections. They carry surnames and traditions and recipes and poems that trace directly back to the valley where Shibam still stands. Yemen's story did not end. It dispersed. And that matters. Because it means that what happens to Yemen's heritage does not only affect the people currently living inside its borders. It affects a vast, scattered community of people for whom these places are not tourist sites. They are home. They are identity. They are the answer to the question of where they come from. Protecting Yemen's past is not archaeology. It is an act of keeping people whole. We started this video with a city made of mud that shouldn't exist. And we end it the same way we began, with the quiet, stubborn fact of Yemen's existence. Not despite everything. Because of everything. Because of every flood survived and every tower rebuilt and every generation that looked at what their parents left them and decided it was worth keeping. I want to leave you with one image. Not a ruin. Not a UNESCO plaque. Not a headline. A window. In the old city of Sana'a, high up in one of those ancient tower houses, there is a camarilla, one of those stained glass panels set into the stone, through which afternoon light falls in fragments of amber and rose and deep green onto a floor that has felt that same light fall on it for centuries. Someone swept that floor this morning. Someone will sweep it tomorrow. That continuity, that ordinary, unglamorous, daily act of choosing to remain, is what civilizations are actually made of. Not the monuments, not the kings, not the engineering marvels as extraordinary as they are. The people who stayed, the people who swept. Yemen has been called many things. Arabia Felix, the Manhattan of the desert, a humanitarian crisis, a cautionary tale. But before any of those labels and underneath all of them, Yemen is simply one of the oldest, deepest, most layered human stories on Earth. A story that is still being written by people who never stopped believing it was worth telling. The towers of Shibam are still standing. The camarillas are still scattering their light. The dragon blood trees are still bleeding red into the Socotra soil. And somewhere in Wadi Hadramaut, right now, someone is sitting in a mafraj chewing cat, watching the afternoon light change over the desert, and telling a story their grandfather told them. This place doesn't feel real, but it is, and it deserves to be remembered.